Já, herru, takk hérlega fyrir að mæta öll á fyrirlesturinn. Þetta fyrsti fyrirlestaraðurinn í ár og við ætlum að byrja hérna fyrstu fyrirlesturinn verða á Zoom og síðan munum við svona hægt og rólega að færa okkur yfir í raunheimana svona þegar COVID casein hafa lækkað. Við erum mjög glöð að hafa fengið Howard með okkur til að halda fyrsta fyrirlesturinn. Hann sérfræðingur í að rannsaka dauða og landshætti og hefur gefið út fjöldan allan bókunum það. Past in the Past kannski hans þekktasta bók, en það eru fleiri mjög skemmtilegar. Hann er mjög duglegur við að kynna fornleifafræðina gegnum Twitter og YouTube. Ég sendi ykkur hérna username-in hans inn á gegnum netfangið. Fyrirkomulagið þannig að þetta verður eins og fyrra. Howard mun tala í 40 mínútur og síðan verða spurningar eftir og við munum, þegar Howard búinn að tala, þá munum við kynna hvernig spurt verður svo allir tala ekki einu. Take it away, Howard.
Right, let's go for, hopefully you'll be able to see my slides now. Hello, everybody, and welcome to my talk, Death and Fire in Early Medieval Europe, Rethinking the Cremation Sensation. Now, I will give this talk with lots of slides and not much detail because I want to give you a bit of an overview of things that I've been working on over the last 20 years and things that I'm moving towards, so you have a sense of what's to come. So it's not a narrow presentation, it's a broad sweep. And what I've done before in a couple of keynote talks at various conferences on death and burial in 2018 and 2019 is present a broader discussion of this, and I've done a YouTube video reviewing those presentations called The Cremation Sensation. But I now want to focus and take this forward by looking at early medieval cremation, particularly my work on early Anglo-Saxon England, but I will be also referring to other periods and places as we go along. So I hope it's something of interest as we go through, and I'll put references to some of my publications so you can follow this up if you're interested. And I want to start with this quote from a big book on the history of death by Thomas W. Leclerc from 2015, The Work of the Dead, The Cultural History of Mortal Remains, where this quote, it's always good to go into a big book and find a quote that annoys you and use it as your straw man. But he does say this is a quote from the book. There had been almost no changes in how the dead were burned from the earliest times until the 1870s. And what he means by that, I think, in general terms, is that the rise of modern cremation practices across Europe and subsequently across the world of indoor processing of the dead by fire saw a fundamental change from cremation practices that came before. And that's not wrong. That's not inaccurate at all. He's perfectly right. But of course, it does reveal how easy it is to slip into this perception that all past cremation practices, all past societies that used fire to transform the dead, partially or wholly, you know, it was all the same kind of thing. It was the same kind of technology, the same kind of process. And I suppose it's a bigger problem for us as archaeologists of death. We have so much rich evidence coming from many different periods and places on a global scale. We want to write our local narratives. We want to perhaps talk in general terms. But when we're dealing with the cremated dead, I think we're still dealing with a massive deficit of knowledge. Within our own discipline and also in interdisciplinary debates, I think the value and significance of archaeological findings and investigations by bioarchaeologists, field archaeologists, and other investigators into cremation in the archaeological record, and the importance of that story for broader understandings of the history of death, of human relationships with the dead, I think hasn't yet been told. I think there's still a deficit in our own discipline and in our interdisciplinary debates, but also in our broader connections to contemporary society, our broader relationships of archaeology to our broader society today. And I want to address that with early medieval cremation by going through this. Rethinking early medieval cremation practices, which is still work ongoing, not just by me, but by many scholars. And I just want to introduce you to some of the ways in which I've tried to do that, but that's just a part of a broader study. How we have there's still an ongoing deficit of knowledge and understanding of how we communicate those practices, those past death rituals, to modern audiences, how we display cremated human materials in museums, heritage sites, and we depict it through text, but also through images. I think there's still a long way to go to think about how we display the dead, the cremated dead in particular. And I think there's also a third point I'll come to. There's a broader challenge for us all as archaeologists and mortuary archaeologists or burial archaeologists to communicate or investigate the consumption and circulation and the recursive relationship between our study of cremation in the human past and pop culture today. And I hope to come and show you some examples of each of these. So let's get on with it. And I want to start by rethinking early medieval cremation practices. And I would say that influential work by human osteologists such as Jackie McKinley and Julie Bond, and a range of other field investigators and syntheses have over the last 30 years taken us a long way. My own work, for example, on early Anglo-Saxon cremation practices built on the work of Catherine Hills, Jackie McKinley, as I mentioned, and Julie Bond on the work of the investigations at Spong Hill, but also on a range of other investigators such as Julian D. Richards to interpret the 5th, 6th, early 7th century cremation practices of southern and eastern Britain. So here's photographs from the 70s. You can tell it's the 70s of cremations being excavated at Spong Hill. A photograph of one of the urns still containing its cremated remains, but you can also see an antler comb fragment and some of the cremated remains separated out from the pot to remind us that ancient cremation does not destroy the body, it transforms it. And while reduced in size, fragmented, distorted, there is still a lot of information we can gain about the pyre technology and the age, sex, stature, pathologies that individual had that was put in that pot. In this case, they are mainly urned cremations. And my thesis trying to sort of pull apart the culture historic inheritance of there being an Anglo-Saxon burial rite in which there was one option was to burn the dead and another option was to bury the dead. And I approached this in different ways. And the first thing I did was to reconfigure our maps for how we interpret where cremation occurs in relation to inhumation in the 5th and 6th and early 7th centuries. And this map I published, but is still ignored by specialists and broader commentaries, although I saw a recent new book, popular book, did take it on board, what I found in this. And it simply shows the relative proportions of cremation in different areas. And I've identified that there is a big, as some people have already speculated or suggested, 3 areas where cremation is very rare: in Kent, in Wiltshire, and in the far north of the sort of lowland British zone, in East Yorkshire and North. And then there are 2 distinctive zones that culture historically are called Saxon and Angle, but do actually show very different uses of cremation. It's not a presence or absence, but it's about relative proportion, with inhumation and mixed rite cemeteries in Midlands, Southern Midlands, East Midlands, and Southern Britain, Southern England, and then an East Anglian and East Midlands area where we have these big cremation cemeteries. And then, of course, having mapped this both confirmed some of the previous traditional views, but actually allowed us to see these communities in different ways, as not adopting one mode of disposal, but differentiating locally and regionally in how they dealt with death and deployed the technology of cremation in varying local ways. And so that's just one example of how, a more careful, refined, simple mapping of the existing burial evidence can take us into new interpretations. Another area which my doctoral thesis and subsequent publications looked at was rethinking how we thought about the objects found in these urns, which some scholars had looked at in quite some detail before and done statistical analysis of which objects are found with particular age and osteologically sexed individuals, the different sizes of pots and so on. But I looked at it from a particularly different perspective, and I identified that certain objects associated with the body's external surface, toilet implements and combs, seem to have a particularly important role and a different role in the funerary ritual. And many of the items, like this is the photograph I showed you before of the pot before excavation with a fragment of bone, antler comb, probably antler, and this another fragment of antler comb from another pot. And these items, such as shears, tweezers, and razors, I suggested had a particularly important role in the post-cremation funerary ritual because they're often found unburnt and in greater frequency than other objects. And I suggested that this was to do with how cremation was understood by early medieval communities, that they were, at least some of them, were thinking of cremation not as destruction, but as about a body building process of transforming the body by fire, but then following it up with a reconstitution of the body using the objects that had been used to groom and manage head hair, facial hair, and the body more broadly. So I suggested these were objects of remembering and forgetting, of manipulating how the dead person was perceived by mourners, and that the grave goods had a kind of mnemonic agency, had a particular active role in that process. It wasn't just the action of fire on the body, it was the choice of objects to accompany the dead into the pot. And one particular phrase I thought about these is that these objects themselves might not be particularly significant. These weren't grand heirlooms or status symbols or, you know, symbols of gender or identity, because they're often found cross-cutting age and gender and wealth groups within the cemetery. Instead, they're more catalysts. They facilitate the process of remembering the dead through the process of the funeral. So they're not significant in themselves, but they facilitate this way in which the dead are being reconstituted in terms of personhood and remembrance. And so it's creating a new body for the dead out of the pot and the objects. Here's one from Alwalton in Cambridgeshire. This was commercial excavations about 15 years ago, a mixed rite cemetery with 33 inhumation graves, 30 cremations, 28 earned, 2 unearned. But most of them had grave goods, 70% had grave goods, 16, that's 59%, had combs. So combs in this particular cemetery were particularly selected out for inclusion. And they hadn't been burnt on the pyre. These combs were largely unburnt and fragments. In this case, it's a whole comb, but most of them, it looks like they deliberately snapped the comb to put half of the comb in the pot. So they were token or fragments, a memento mori, if you like. So only part of the object goes with the dead, part goes elsewhere. Only one comb showed evidence of being burnt. And there were also tweezers, a toilet set with a hone. And therefore we're looking at this idea, as I said, of dissolution. And perhaps it's about the family and the kin, you know, remembering the dead person through objects that catalyzed transformation of memory. And this is another example from Alwalton showing you a pot. Obviously, these are different scales of object, but it shows you, it gives you that sense of these objects to do with the external body surface. And this varied between cemeteries. So in another cemetery in a different part of England, we have another set of objects with these miniature combs and iron miniature toilet sets that were almost too small to be used by living people, placed with the dead. So were these special objects that had an amuletic function? We're still discussing those kind of questions. So these are the ways in which we start to look at cremation in the early medieval past, and we start to think of it spatially and in terms of material in varied and fresh ways. Another set of work I've been looking at is looking at the pots. Now these pots, and there's brand new work by Gareth Perry on this, it's fascinating too. But the pots are the most distinctive things about early Anglo-Saxon cremation burial. We have these on the continent too, and in parts of southern Scandinavia, northern Germany, big cremation cemeteries with distinctive urns. Now, these pots weren't necessarily made for the funeral. Indeed, the work of Gareth Perry is showing that these were pots that were part of the domestic assemblage. They were part of people's lives, and they were then added to, they became selected for as cinerary urns to contain the remains of the dead. So unlike maybe if you're being cremated today and family pick a vessel, or you, when you're alive, you pick an urn where it's a special urn for that function. These are probably vessels that had other functions, probably used for storing or even brewing butter and beer is one of the suggestions of Perry. Now, some of them are highly decorated and have stamped decoration of animals. And a few of them have these weird bosses on them that when they survive almost look like they're called animated pots. They have animals and abstract designs that sort of protect and sort of enwrap the pot. And there's lots of ways of thinking about these abstract designs and lots of ways we can go about understanding them. But one idea that me and a doctoral student at the time, Ruth Nugent, came up with was that as well as these are not so much about the visual, there's two things. Firstly, it's much about handling the pot and having a distinctive pot that you're protecting, creating this new body for the dead, and that you can carry, you can transport, you can store in the home, and then finally bury. So it makes the dead portable and contained, obviously. But also maybe the choice of design for the pot may have been about creating almost like a little sort of living community, where the pot gives a sort of animated surface for the dead. Some of them may be even trying to emulate not only animal designs, but body part designs. And it's surprising, it's not one of the parts of our argument is this distinctive chairperson from Spong Hill, a pot lid, which has this little seated figure upon it. This is the famous Spong Hill chairperson, which is unique, and like all unique objects, therefore prompts all manner of speculative ideas you'll find on social media and other places about this little figure. It's almost impossible to replicate his sitting position. I get students to do this, try to put your hands on your knees and then put them behind your head, and it doesn't work unless you're a gibbon. So it's hardly an artistic, naturalistic representation. But one point I've made about this pot is that if this could be just one exceptional ceramic version of many other wooden vessels, wooden pot lids. And so, could these urns have had little animated figures on top, watching outwards, protecting the contents, maybe representing ancestors, maybe representing deities? We don't know. But it does make us think about the nature of the pot as really significant. And the choice of urn and the choice of pot lid may have been carefully selected to honor the dead, to protect the dead, to give a body for the dead, a sort of presence for the dead in a shallow little grave. And this makes us think, I feel, about the range of other ways in which we can think of objects and surfaces added to cremation burials that have not really received attention. And across Europe, we find different cremation strategies with different burial strategies following. So, for example, in central Sweden in the Viking Age, we have these what are called Thor hammer rings. And, the interpretation has therefore been this is something to do with the deity Thor. But of course, this is one of these modern antiquarian / early archaeological inferences that sticks. And just because we call them these things, that somehow means we therefore follow up that as a narrative of how we understand these objects. But of course, it's not certain that that's the case at all. One thing that is striking is that these rings with multiple tools, miniature tool representations on them, and therefore usually called amulets of some kind, are iron and are placed with the cremated dead. And therefore we may be looking at some kind of other kind of catalyst in a similar way to I was talking about the combs from Anglo-Saxon England, sort of 400, 500 years earlier, different part of Europe. The idea that somehow this object does something to the dead, allows the dead to go on whatever journey or form whatever new identity they were perceived to be having. We don't know for sure. I've published some ideas, some crazy ideas about what that might be. But my point would be, rather than thinking about these objects just as a category of artifact, we think about how they would have worked within the cremation process to do something, to have a power in the process of cremating, then collecting the ashes, and then interring them in a pot or in a burial pit. And elsewhere in Europe, we can find other examples of this. The islands have these distinctive clay bear paws, or are they beaver paws? There's a whole debate about what animal they might represent, buried in some late Iron Age cremation burial. So we have a, what are these doing? They're not expensive, they're not complex items. They may be relating to a very specific cosmology, about understanding of where the dead were going in the afterlife, but they are another kind of catalyst, an object that may have had a significance because of its choice to place it after cremation, to give the ashes a new identity of some form. And I think these are the kind of objects that I would call catalysts of they're not significant in themselves, but they prompt and configure new ways of understanding the dead. And another example from Witten Cemetery, this is the work of Tor Artelius, found that actually there were selections of even stones that may have been carefully placed in these cremation pots as well. And therefore another example of an object that was perhaps just commonly occurring, but these large fragments that may have been broken during the cremation process were added to the pot deliberately for whatever precise purpose we don't know. But another object type that's not perhaps valued objects significant in some kind of holy or symbolic sense in an overt way, but they're objects that facilitate an understanding of what the dead are supposed to become. And the problem is we can't get inside the minds of past people, and even if we did, we may not be any of the wiser about what these burial rituals were supposed to mean. And another way we can look at early medieval cremation is looking at the relationship between burials. So jumping back to early Anglo-Saxon England, here is a section of the Spong Hill Cemetery, and all the little dots there represent cremation burials, and you can see the poorly preserved in terms of osteological remains, but very distinct grave cuts of the inhumation graves in this northern section. And another way we can think about burial rite is the relationship between the disposal methods, because as you can see, some of these graves, there's overlap between the burial traditions. There's some evidence of inhumation graves cutting into pre-existing cremations, but also a lot of evidence of cremations being added to the tops and into inhumation burials, suggesting that these were not different communities with different disposal methods. There were people living in close proximity that for some reason, some people just were inhumed and some people were cremated. And this may not be a simple decision based on age, gender, status, or ethnicity or religious belief. It may be to do with making circumstances of death or localized distinctions in how the dead are understood. And we can't always deconstruct that, but my point would be that there's never a time in the early Middle Ages where cremation was not an option and when inhumation was the only option, or the other way around, where cremation was always practiced and no one was inhumed. These rites were always, as in our society, operating as choices within a broader spectrum, and we cannot understand them in isolation. So one of the points I've made about early Anglo-Saxon cremations is we need to look at the urns and the choices of pottery use in the inhumation graves in relation to their use in cremation urns, and then we find interesting patterns of choices. I can't go into all that here, but we can actually pick out, in particular at Spong Hill, that actually pots seem to have been a significance as containers of the dead, but also placed with the inhumed dead in a way that you don't find in other cemeteries. So local communities are working through these attitudes to objects and the relationship between objects and personhood in death in subtly different ways we can pick out in the burial record. And when people aren't being cremated, burning may still be important. For example, in this famous for me anyway, Snape grave 47, a small boat grave of the late 6th century, a weapon burial. The human remains are poorly preserved, but you've got multiple spearheads, a shield boss, a sword, and this is the stain surviving from a small craft. There's also a horse's head here with the rein still on it, and the bridle leading down into the grave itself, which is an interesting feature. But what I want to point out here is there's a piece of burnt timber dumped in the grave as well. So in this case, no one's cremating the dead, but a piece of charred timber is being placed in the grave. Was that being placed charred so that the smoke diffused, created a sense of purification, or was that a piece of a relic of a pyre of a loved one from a previous funeral that sort of makes a connection to a different funeral and a different disposal method? You know, we're not sure, but we're finding this more and more, that there are connections of use of burning in disposal methods that don't involve the burning of the body. So there's more to cremation than simply burning the dead or not burning the dead. There are clearly connections between these rites. And another final point I want to make about how we can rethink early Anglo-Saxon and early medieval cremations more broadly is thinking about the fact that so often we're seduced into thinking that the only way you can deal with cremated dead is bury them. And we've long had evidence that at a range of Anglo-Saxon cemeteries of the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries, we've not only got inhumations and cremation burials, we've got a third type of structure. 4 or 5 post structures, sometimes with ring ditches, that some people have called barrows, some people have called mortuary houses. But what's a suggestion that Katie Myers-Emery and I published 3 or 4 years ago in the Archaeological Journal is that these may have been actually small columbaria, rather than just simply structures marking individual cremation burials. Or the other idea is they may be pyre sites, which we discount and other people have discounted too. But these 4 post structure here at Lechlade, many of them are Appledown here. And this is a reconstruction of how the Appledown Cemetery may have looked. It doesn't quite work because it assumes all burials are fresh and new at the same time, which no cemeteries like that. But it gives you a sense of how the hillside may have looked with these little mortuary houses. We actually suggest that maybe this is a distribution map of these sites, this area where we only have mixed rite cemeteries mainly down here, but also some up into the area where we have cremating cemeteries, that they may have been more like this, small little houses where you could store perhaps 5, 10, 20, 30 pots containing the cremated remains of the dead. So rather than having a bi-ritual society where you mixed rite, where you cremate or you inhume, maybe there was a tripartite division in a choice of disposal method in Anglo-Saxon England between burial unburned, burial after cremation, and storage above ground after cremation. And that possibility has really not been articulated before our 2018 paper. So that's really interesting, because that then helps us to rethink some of the very interesting traces we find in and around cemeteries, and helps to inform what field investigators look for when they start to look at early Anglo-Saxon burial grounds. We maybe need to look for traces of these kinds of structures associated with other disposal methods. So what I'm trying to do for you is to give you some examples from my work of how we can think about the complexity and variability of early medieval cremation, mainly looking at early Anglo-Saxon England, but also looking elsewhere. And this takes us to the cemetery. What was a cemetery in these different cremating early medieval societies? The work of Anna Westman on Finnish cremation really fascinates me, and we published a paper together in 2017 looking at these cremation cemeteries under level ground, which rather than simple disposal of individual burials are almost like scattering areas around local landmarks, Bronze Age burial mounds, and large distinctive stones where the dead seem to be scattered, maybe cremated, but certainly their ashes scattered with artifacts over centuries, almost like landscape features that incorporate the dead over many generations into the same structure. So the dead are almost forgotten into the landscape. And in contrast to that, we have examples such as the late 6th, early 7th century princely burial mounds of Anglo-Saxon England, where we do have some very large mounds, this one excavated in the early 20th century at Astle in Oxfordshire, very poorly excavated, but where we have very high status burials. And these are seen to be royal or princely, but most of the focus has been on the inhumation, the famous ones being Mound 1 at Sutton Hoo, Taplow in Buckinghamshire, and the more most recent one, of course, the Prittlewell chamber grave. But Astle is an example of a cremation of this high status group that was in a very strategic location. This is work I did as a doctoral student years ago, showing how the Astle Barrow is not just an arbitrary location. It's one of the few barrows in that landscape that overlooks the existing artery of the Akeman Street Roman Road above the river valley in a very prominent distinctive location, very different from many of the Bronze Age and Neolithic monuments of the area. And this takes us to even the most famous of early Anglo-Saxon burial grounds, Sutton Hoo itself, which is still talked about mainly in terms of its famous Mound 1 chamber burial. But actually, a lot of the evidence from here is cremation. Almost all of the Martin Carver field season excavations produce cremations, apart from Mound 17, Mounds 2, 14, and 1. So there's 4 inhumed bodies in big mounds. And most of the other burials show evidence that have been excavated 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 18 are cremations. So that factor hasn't really been thought through in terms of how we interpret this burial site, this short-lived princely burial site in a prominent location in the landscape. And my point would be that understanding these high status burial sites, we need to think about cremation in new ways. And then once we've understood that, we can then reapproach the select few that weren't cremated and think about them in a new light, in the drawing from the fact that we've come to a new interpretation of the cremation. So it's almost where we're looking at the big fancy burials where they didn't burn the dead, and that may be the wrong starting point. And there's one final thing about interpreting early medieval cremations, is that in the early Middle Ages, people were finding old cremations all the time in the landscape. And this is a site I investigated with colleagues at Bangor University. This is the Pillar of Elizeg. And this is a Christian cross fragment. This is after Christian conversion. This is 9th century, still situated on a burial mound that was undated until our excavations. And our work from 2010 to 2012 inside of this scheduled ancient monument in the Welsh landscape. So we're outside of Anglo-Saxon England here, but only just in early medieval Wales. And we were able to prove that this is a multi-phase Bronze Age curved cairn. And some people had speculated that before, but we were able to demonstrate that actually this Christian cross erected in the 9th century to the Powys dynasty, an early medieval kingdom that we know very little about, was situated deliberately on this Bronze Age, over 2,500 year old, or 2,000 year older ancient mound in a prominent location in this distinctive valley. And one of the things that the points we make is that just like we did when we excavated, early medieval people would have also found ancient kists here poking out of the surface, because our excavations revealed these were very near the surface. They're very superficially positioned secondary cremation burials, as you often find in northern and western Britain in the Bronze Age. These mounds have multiple phases, as they do in southern Britain as well, and eastern Britain. And so our point would be that they would have come across perhaps these remains of ancient cremated Bronze Age people. And so another factor we need to think about in the early Middle Ages is people would have not only cremated the dead themselves, but even after cremation was out of fashion, they would have encountered cremated remains of ancient people. And what would they have made of these remains? How would they have understood those remains? And did that inspire the choice of location for this prominent Christian cross? So there's some of the ways in which we can think about, that's the longest and first part of my talk, and that gets that out of the way. Some of the ways we can think about cremation in the early medieval landscape, and the diversity of ways in which we understand the material cultures, the monuments, the spatial distributions of cremating practices. And rather than see it as just all one lumping thing, there's many different early medieval communities that are doing very different and diverse things with the cremated dead. And that's only part of the picture, and work by Femke Lippok and others is taking this forward across northwestern Europe and looking at diversity and variability in cremation practices in very exciting new ways. But if I would say there's still a deficit in knowledge, as I said, about how we understand early medieval cremation, there's also a deficit of popular understanding of how we should communicate these results. Oh, I've gone out of my PowerPoint. How did I do that? I shouldn't have done that. Ah, there we are. Don't know what happened there, but anyway. And my second point is about displaying the dead in museums. And when we look at how museums display cremated material, this is the British Museum, and I'm quite proud that at least the small caption, when it was redesigned, at least seems to incorporate at least some of my ideas about early Anglo-Saxon cremation practices and how they display this. But you know, in the many thousands, hundreds of thousands of people each year who go to the Sutton Hoo and medieval Europe, early medieval Europe gallery in the British Museum, and they see these humble traces of cremation, I suspect very few will go away with an understanding of the spectacle, the complexity, the variability of cremation practices in the early Middle Ages, and because this is all they get. And that's not the curators failing, that's the failing of us collectively to explain the variety and complexity of these funerary rites and their importance for understanding early medieval societies. If you go to Norwich Castle Museum, this is from 10 years ago, the Spong Hill pots are all on display, and they explain that they're from cremation rituals and they're cinerary urns, and there's discussions of the runic inscriptions and the variety. But really, I think it's most visitors would be forgiven for not understanding what these rites were about and the broader society and cosmology in which they may have been performed. And the same problem applies to our artist reconstructions. This is a deliberately cartoonish one from a World Archaeology paper in 1996 by Julie Bond, simply to make the point in her article where she's a zoo archaeologist, so she was looking at the animal bone from Spong Hill and Sancton in East Yorkshire, that actually cremation in the early Anglo-Saxon period would have involved a lot of animal sacrifice, and the pyres would look very different once we take that into account. So I don't want to criticize the detail of her artist reconstruction, but my point would be this is far from ideal for public engagement and understanding. Victor Ambrus, the famous, now sadly late Victor Ambrus, Time Team illustrator, everyone will know, was commissioned by Martin Carver to do an artist reconstruction for Sutton Hoo of Mound 6. And while it is like all Victor's illustrations, it's fantastic in many ways, showing a sort of late 6th century cremation. It doesn't give you any sense of the sequence, the spectacle, the complexity, the variability of cremation practices. It's just a small group of people putting a pot in the ground, very much like almost you could imagine modern people. That's a good point in itself, but it doesn't really give you that sense. And from Fern's 2015 publication of the Tranmere House excavations, this artist reconstruction, this is a black and white version, the original was in colour, by Kate Morton, is better because it shows people arriving, it shows horse about to be sacrificed, it shows the monumental scale of the pyre, it shows people cooking and eating, it gives you a sense of the ceremony, but perhaps I would suggest it still doesn't give you a sense of the sequence and the variability of cremation practices. So I would say that we as well as a deficit in our ability to understand the early medieval cremation, perhaps our artist reconstructions, our museum displays are failing to communicate what we do know to the public anyway. Over 15 years ago, I want to say Kelvin Wilson, for the front cover of our book, Dutch-based artist Kelvin Wilson did this originally for the Sutton Hoo Visitor Centre of a high status cremation, and he reworked it for the cover of our OUP book from 2017. And this again has its benefits in showing community, the scale of the rites of a high status cremation, but we could say that perhaps on its own as a static image, it doesn't take us so far. Now, 15 years ago, Erin Watson, an archaeological illustrator and archaeologist, and I worked together to create 3 digital images to try and look at early Anglo-Saxon cremation in a different way. And these are the results from a scene from a dead person in a house being prepared for their journey, the cremation at night in itself from a different perspective, and a first-person perspective sifting through the pyre, because so few accounts show the importance we find in the archaeological evidence, the post-cremation rituals. So we wanted an image showing something of that impression of the importance of the labour of selecting through the ashes. But I'm not saying these are perfect. They have their own problems with them, and there are only 3 images. And so my point would be, I still think there's a lot more that needs to be done to put these, to explain, to visualize, to display cremation in the human past, and including the early Middle Ages, to the public today. And there's some reading about works where I've tried to think about how we interpret past cremation practices in museum context and in heritage context and in our publications and in our art. I think there's a big challenge there for us. And my third and final part is to simply make the point that there's a whole separate sub area where I think we're missing a trick of realizing how important early medieval cremation is in popular culture. And yet our archaeological understandings aren't reaching this popular understandings. or engaging with it as much as they could. Give you an example. Most early medieval cremations, I think, are popularly understood through the Anglo-Saxon poem Beowulf. And in recent years, there's been a host of comics linked to multiple films showing the Beowulf story, the Anglo-Saxon poem Beowulf, and particularly Beowulf's own funeral, and taking it in all manner of different directions. This, for example, is Neil Gaiman and Roger Avery's 2008. This is the comic that linked to the film, the animated film, starring Ray Winstone and Angelina Jolie, that came out, which had all manner of fantastical elements, late medieval castles. You know, it was very far removed from the aesthetic of an early medieval world. And surprise, surprise, they take cremation, the Beowulf, the funeral of the hero Beowulf, onto a ship and set fire to him on the water, which of course is something that never is described in the poem, but fits our aspirations for a Viking / early medieval funeral. Of course, that's what you would do. What else could you possibly do than stick someone on a boat, throw them out to sea, and set fire to it with flaming arrows, or just some other method? Yeah, flaming arrows, because that's what happened to Kirk Douglas in the 1958 film The Viking. So it must be true. Other comics show different versions. Totally implausible pyres, that's not going to burn anyone anytime soon, but at least they put it in a topographically inspiring location linked to the description in the poem. This one is really interesting, Santiago Garcia and David Rubin's 2016 comic, because they put him on a boat, but at least they show something of the sequence, the wailing of the story, the reflections on mortality and warrior life. There's a wonderful sequence as the ashes, you know, as the body burns and the sparks rise from the pyre. So, you know, not true to the poem, but at least it's thinking about process and gives you that sense of the nighttime evocation of fire. This one by Petruccia and Chamberlain from 2007. I like the way that it links to ascent and the smoke ascending, which is a theme in the poem, to sort of a little spark, maybe a star, you know, this idea of spiritual ascent with cremation. But of course, you'll get the key point that all of our archaeological evidence is about what happens after cremation, to the careful choices and treatment of the dead. And the poem Beowulf talks about the building of a big barrow, but nobody shows it because they're fascinated by this burning event. This is my favorite, for what it's worth, by Stern, Sterling and Studebaker. Just because I love the nighttime darkness of it and the spears sticking out of the pyre. But it, again, the burning is all there is. And of course, where are we getting this? This is part of our love. We love cremation. We love various different fictional fantasy versions of early medieval cremation, from Game of Thrones. I've also published and reflected on the TV show Vikings, which does engage with various different mythological, legendary, fantastical Viking funerals. I defend the show to the point that I don't think they're even trying to be historically accurate. It's not about that. It's about showing a sort of legendary early Viking age, various different kinds of cremations in different circumstances, on land, on water, during raiding, during peacetime, caused by disease. And at least in that regard, the TV show shows you variability in cremation practices. And they never admit why people are burning the dead as opposed to not burning the dead, which I think is really a point of merit, in a sense, that they don't get drawn into trying to explain these things in any coherent way. They have a seer who's burnt as a secret death, as a sort of getting rid of a dangerous spirit and also in season 6, I've got yet to publish about this, but I have aspirations to. I've done a blog post about this. Don't want to be a spoiler, but one of the key characters gets the most ludicrous, almost a whole episode dedicated to her funeral, which is a phenomenon in itself we should all be interested in. But here's two screen captures from the Cremation on Ice of Lagatha in season 6, part 1. So my point would be that cremation is part of our theatre of death in TV and in comic books, but it's so dislocated from our archaeological evidence. It's difficult to see how that mythological traditions is linked to our archaeological stories. And yet, in parts of our world, people are being inspired directly by the later prehistoric and early medieval funerary records to construct how we dispose our own dead. So here on the island of Gotland, Schalinga, you have a garden of remembrance, a Minneslund, configured around a crudely Iron Age, early medieval style of burial mound, with the Viking Age weather vane on display still within the church, replicated and put on the top of a cross. And here at Motala in Östergötland in Sweden, we have a modern crematorium with burial patches for the cremated dead laid out to look like ship settings and Iron Age grave fields, Iron Age cemeteries. So it's almost we're landscape designers for our dead are taking inspiration from the Swedish landscape and from archaeological monuments. So perhaps there is hope that our archaeological stories actually may disappear and get ignored in our fiction, but in our reality of our deaths, maybe we'll see some slow percolation of archaeological thinking and ideas over the next half century. So there's some readings I've been doing about publishing on the popular culture of death ritual and the early Middle Ages and also in terms of cemetery, modern cemeteries, how archaeological ideas, not just from the early Middle Ages, but from other periods, are inspiring modern choices of disposal. So where does this take us as a conclusion? Well, we have such rich and varied set of archaeological data, new methods, new ideas, new discoveries are transforming our understanding of early medieval societies. And I'm pulling this together in an edited book with a range of contributors with a doctoral researcher at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, Femke Lippok. So watch this space. There's a broader challenge of interpreting, however, this material for the public, of public engagement. And I think we've got to do different and we've got to do better in telling the story of early medieval cremations to modern audiences, because it matters for them, because we are in cremating societies. Most of Northern and Western Europe are either prominently cremating societies now or are heading that way. And now, after the last 5 years, even the US has caught up, and over 50% of people in the US are now cremated. And we've got a broader responsibility still, I would say, to engage with popular culture manifestations of early medieval cremation. We may cringe when we watch particular TV shows. We may point out some of the dangers of the misrepresentations, but I think we still have a responsibility to talk about this as part of how we are engaging with and discussing our stories to a broader modern world. So those are my 3 points that I came back to. I said I'd get to them, and that's how I got back to them at the end. So as I said, Femke and I've got this book forthcoming. Here's some other sort of broader collections on cremation and broader statements about where research is going. And I think we do have to continue to write the stories of early medieval people and how they dealt with death and dying and disposal of the dead, including cremation and relations between cremation and other disposal methods. But we also have to tackle how we envisage and display these remains in museums and heritage sites, and also how we tackle the many myths and misrepresentations in our popular culture. Thank you very much.